Well, there's been some pretty wild weather recently, and you could be fooled by headlines into thinking that the world is having a massive meltdown, kind of like a pimply teenager's face having breakouts all over the place. It's a disaster if you believe the headlines, but the data tells a slightly different story. Joining me now is Aussie Wire regular Joanne Nova. Thank you so much, Joe, as always, for coming on.
Thank you, Topher.
Now, it is true. I don't believe I'm exaggerating to say that the headlines are pretty relentlessly negative and telling us just how awful everything is.
Climate porn, as we say it. The people predicting the end of the world, people saying it's all going to come to it's tragic, and every single storm and flood and drought and bushfire and reckless fish, it's all due to climate change. And now big snowfalls too. Everything. It's all climate change.
You know, I'm not an old man, but I'm old enough to remember that someone walking around with a sandwich board that said "the end is nigh" used to be laughed at. It seems like these days we elect them.
Not only elect them, but we put them in charge of the World Health Organization or the WHO.
We give them a budget and tell them to go for it. Yeah, sadly.
Yeah, exactly. Antonio Guterres saying the world oceans are boiling. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And what's the difference between him and the sandwich board guy standing there saying it's the end of the world, give me $2? Well, he's asking for $2 trillion and is in danger of getting some of it.
Yeah. Well, this is an interesting piece of data that you brought to my attention, Joe, and this is from Our World in Data, showing that since about 1990, so the last just over 30 years, we've basically doubled the amount of atmospheric CO2 that we as a species have put into the atmosphere. I think you were saying it's 1 trillion tons. Have I got that right?
It is indeed 1 trillion tonnes of CO2, man-made emissions, put out since 1990, more than half of all the emissions made by humans, in theory, since we walked in, lived in caves and whatnot, the entire human history and prehistory that we can count. Humans' contribution, half of that was after 1990, and it hasn't made any difference. All that CO2 and nothing to show for it when it comes to extreme damage and weather losses. And this was a study done by Roger Pielke Jr., and, what's really interesting here is the conflict between all of the headlines we see every day about how this storm and this flood is so much worse, and the, damage losses are $27 billion trillion more than they used to be, that kind of stuff. And yet when he adjusts for inflation, and not only for inflation, but adjusts for GDP. So GDP is, as we discussed before, it's a pretty bad, sloppy measure, but it's the only way we have to kind of capture all the extra houses, tractors, cars, all of the sitting duck kind of stuff, the factories that are out there waiting for floods, hail, storm surges, and bushfires to destroy. And so the crazy idea here is we built so much stuff, and Roger Pielke Jr. has this photo on his website of the difference between, I think, Shenzhen in the last 30 years, tiny flat city with 3-story buildings, and now it's got skyscrapers. And so this enormous transformation, and yet we're not seeing more damage. Storms are hitting all of these extra people, these extra farms, these extra machinery, and it's not doing more damage as a percentage of the economy globally than it ever did. And that's the weird thing, because you would think that it would.
Well, I'm a bit of a GDP skeptic. I've covered this in previous interviews with economists and others here on the show. I consider the GDP to be the worst possible way of measuring an economy, with the exception of all of the others. It's just the least bad one that we've come up with. However, in moments like this, it is at least useful to find trends. And what we see very, very clearly here is that, in fact, as a percentage of GDP, despite, as you say, more people, more houses, more cars, more private jets, more things to get damaged or blown over or hailed on, we're actually seeing a declining trend in terms of the amount of damage done. Now, this flies so starkly in contrast to this graph here. I was told... maybe I'm a sucker, maybe I was scammed, but I bought property on top of Uluru because I was told it was going to be beachfront property by the time we'd finished with climate change. Have I been scammed?
Oh, but this is it. All these relentless headlines by journalists saying things like that. And where are our institutions? Where are our academics and our climate scientists? They should be speaking up and saying to the journalists, wait a minute, hang on, you've got this wrong. But they never do because it suits them. So we live in this kind of strange world where the experts are very rarely wheeled out to say their little carefully controlled with lots of conditions kind of statements. But they sit there silent while journalists draw these extrapolations that go, decades into the future in the most ridiculous way and make statements that are flatly wrong, falsely wrong all the time. And, our academics, which we pay so much money for, publicly funded universities, where are they?
Well, speaking of people who are wrong, I can't help but notice that we've had a real flannery of a summer in the southeast of Australia this year. It's been raining flanneries. Our dams are very much well and truly full. This is fascinating to me. We showed a graph a moment ago that showed damage as a percentage of GDP, and we've both expressed our concerns and skepticism, etc. I think this is worth looking at because this is an absolute number. It's not a relative percentage of anything. This is the accumulated cyclone energy. What are we looking at here, Joe?
You make a really good point there, Topher, because, of course, it's possible that with extra GDP, maybe we're just making stronger buildings, better cars that are hail-proof and, skyscrapers that don't fall over and all that kind of stuff. So maybe GDP isn't the greatest way to measure that. But then we look at things like global hurricane energy, cyclone energy, the energy in the storms, and this is... This is a standard unit and measured really well by Ryan Maui. And you look at these numbers and where is the increase? Where is the disaster? Where are the storms? And it's the same thing. When we look at sea levels rising, we see even the satellites are talking about 3 millimeters a year. And these satellites are adjusted. And when we look at tide gauges, the rise is a whole of a millimeter or maybe 1.5 millimeters a year. We're talking about almost nothing.
Next to nothing.
And so all that CO2, half of the evil poison put out by humans, seems to have made no difference at all.
Well, it's quite extraordinary.
Trends in storms, cyclones, and other things, and I think bushfires as well.
I was just about to make that point. We could bring up data on so many different things that we were told were going to get so much worse. And consistently, you're going to see either no trend or a negative trend. Now, I want to point out here, we're looking at over 50 years worth of data. This is not an insubstantial data set. This is basically from once we had satellites that could actually capture all the storms, because, of course, prior to satellites, a hurricane could have happened somewhere and we just didn't even know about it. But what we're looking at here is a sideways trend over more than 50 years. But if you actually look with your eye, go and find 1990. And have a look at the trend from 1990 till now, you'll notice that if there is a trend there, it is a downward trend. And that's over the same period as this graph here showing that we've doubled human emissions, total emissions of atmospheric CO2. I've asked you this question before, Joe, and we've gotten it wrong every single time, but I'm going to have another crack. I'm going to ask you again. At what point does the weight of evidence become enough that this narrative finally crumbles?
Oh, about 20 years ago. We won this debate scientifically 20 years ago, but hardly anybody knows it because the media keep putting forward these scientific lies and falsehoods and the porn where they keep suggesting, oh, look, there's a bad storm. And with climate change, it's only going to get worse. So they tag these two lines together like there is an association. And, people watching the news go, oh, look, another storm, another this, another that. And of course, we've got cameras all around the world now to capture the true disaster of what's going on. Whereas there weren't too many iPhones back in 1920 to record the droughts and floods and bushfires then. And the ones that were there, the camera shots we have, of course, they've just dropped down the memory hole and forget that it ever happened and that things were actually worse in a lot of ways. The good old Federation drought here, shockingly hot, people dropping dead at train stations in Burke in 1896 in January then, but no photos of it, so it didn't happen.
Well, we have historical photos of the Murray, the riverbed being completely dry, people driving wagons across, having picnics in the bed of the Murray River. We know from historical records that not one of the floods that we've seen in Brisbane in my lifetime or even the lifetime before that comes close to the floods that we saw in the late 1700s and early 1800s up there. We know nothing of Mother Nature's fury, and as you correctly point out, we keep blaming it on climate change, but maybe it's just weather.
Well, and that's just it. If you look at that the graph you had of the energy coming off cyclones, we can't predict the ups and downs on that graph. We don't have a chance of saying, look, for this next 5-year period, things are going to be calmer around the world. We can't predict the climate. The models don't work. They're broken. And yet we're betting our entire economy on these broken models. And it's just extraordinary. And think about how much global CO2 has risen. And it has risen. Back in 1990 was about 355 or 360 parts per million around the world. And now it's more like 417, 418 something parts per million. There's no denying that the CO2 has risen. I don't know how much of that was human and how much was natural, because we don't understand what those natural cycles are. But we know, as I've written on the blog, phytoplankton, other things, global warming, there's all kinds of things that cause CO2 to go up. And it may turn out to be that humans didn't drive that. But even if we did, it doesn't seem to make any difference to all the factors that they said it would.
And it certainly doesn't appear to me that there is even remotely enough evidence to say that this is some existential crisis upon which we should enter some massive experiment where we effectively shut down our economy and destroy our own quality of life in order to ward off the evil spirits that have been unleashed by atmospheric CO2. I find the whole thing, it feels like a pagan witch doctor religion.
Very much, yes. And the Stone Age witch doctors have been doing this for years, forecasting storms and saying, I will protect you. Give me your young girls, give me your money, your conch shells, whatever it is, that's the currency. And saying, I will stop the storms. Oh, look, it worked. And same thing here. And it's just crazy that humans seem to be so easily able to be pulled back into that Stone Age kind of reasoning. It's the saddest thing to watch. I mean, and lastly, there's this point. If we accept the CO2 levels have risen, and they have, and we accept that humans caused it, which I'm not sure about, but let's say it has, we've seen that whatever we're doing, the cars, the tractors, the buildings we make, the farms, the factories, whatever we're doing is easily compensating for whatever bad stuff you want to imagine has happened in the last 30 years. So if there is a problem due to man-made CO2, clearly we should just keep doing what we're doing. In other words, economic development means we build things better, stronger, faster, cheaper, and et cetera, et al. And all of that is dealing with whatever CO2 is causing.
100%, Joe. As always, thank you so much. We really appreciate your input here on the Aussie Wire.
Always great to talk to you, Topher.